Okay, let's jump right in. Imagine this. You're back in the Middle Ages,
Right.
and you eat what looks like a totally normal sandwich,
Uh-huh.
and then suddenly, bam, you're hit with convulsions, hallucinations. It sounds completely wild.
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
But it wasn't some kind of, myth or legend. It was terrifyingly real for a lot of people.
And all because of this fungus, ergot, that got into the rye flour.
Exactly. And what's so interesting, kind of the point of our deep dive today, is how this fungus, this source of so much misery, actually has this whole other side.
A medicinal side.
Precisely. We're looking at how it went from causing these awful outbreaks to becoming a source for some really important medicines. We're basing this on a great SciShow video, which had support from Ground News.
Right, and it's such a contrast, isn't it? You've got this toxic psychoactive fungus causing mass poisonings.
And then, centuries later, you find records from the 1500s of it being used to help with childbirth.
And now even treatments for things like Alzheimer's being investigated. It's an incredible story arc.
It really is. That duality makes it fascinating. So maybe let's start with that darker side, the toxic part.
Okay, so the SciShow video explains that the ergot fungus produces these compounds.
Alkaloids?
That's it, alkaloids. They're basically the fungus's defense mechanism, like chemical weapons to stop animals from eating it.
And it's not just one or two. They mentioned over 70 different kinds.
Yeah, over 70 identified alkaloids. It's like a tiny, complex chemical factory packed into this fungus.
So these things get into your system. What happens? The video mentioned effects on circulation and the nervous system.
Right. They can impact both. The circulatory effects are significant, but the neurological ones are often the most dramatic.
How do they affect the brain or the nerves?
Well, they essentially interfere with how your nerve cells communicate. They mess with neurotransmitters.
Ah, the chemical messengers like serotonin and dopamine.
Exactly those. Think of nerve communication as passing notes. These alkaloids can sort of scramble the notes or block them or even send fake ones. It disrupts the whole system. And isn't one of these alkaloids related to, well, something more famous?
You're probably thinking of lysergic acid.
That's the one.
Yeah, it's the precursor, the basic building block for LSD. So that connection really highlights the powerful psychoactive potential hiding in these natural compounds.
Okay, so from medieval poisoning and the basis for LSD, that's quite the reputation. How on earth did it transition into medicine? It seems like a huge jump.
It's a really fascinating part of medical history. The SciShow piece points to midwives, way back in the 1500s.
Midwives, what were they using it for?
Primarily for inducing labor, and it probably wasn't just a random guess either.
No, how did they figure that out?
Well, the theory is they observed what happened to pregnant animals, like pigs, that ate contaminated rye.
Ah, they saw the pigs go into early labor after eating the fungusy grain?
Something like that, yeah. It's a classic example of, learning from observing nature, even if it was accidental observation.
But using it to induce labor sounds risky, especially back then.
Oh, extremely risky. The video makes that clear. It often led to tragic outcomes, like stillbirths. The dosage was impossible to control properly with the raw fungus.
Right. It really highlights that thin line between a medicine and a poison, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So because of those dangers, by the 1820s or so, the thinking had shifted. The recommendation became not for inducing labor, but for controlling bleeding after childbirth.
Postpartum hemorrhaging, which is still a major danger.
Exactly. A much safer, more targeted application. And then came the big breakthrough in the 1930s.
What happened then?
Scientists finally managed to purify ergometrin. They isolated the specific alkaloid that was actually responsible for stopping the bleeding.
Ah, so they could get just the useful compound without all the other potentially harmful stuff.
Precisely. It was a huge step forward, moving from a crude plant remedy to a more refined, predictable drug.
And how does ergometrin work? The video mentioned vasoconstriction.
Yeah, it causes blood vessels to narrow or constrict. And if you narrow the pipes, the flow slows down. Think
Makes
about it.
sense, so it slows the bleeding.
Exactly. And that same mechanism, constricting blood vessels, is why it's also used for migraines, which are often related to blood vessels dilating too much.
Wow. So this compound from a toxic fungus is still used today for childbirth complications and migraines. That's pretty amazing.
It really is. But the medical story didn't stop there. Ergot derivatives have been explored for other things too, particularly neurological disorders.
Like Parkinson's disease. The SciShow video talked about that.
Yes, Parkinson's, which, as you know, involves the breakdown of neurons that produce dopamine.
Right. And dopamine is vital for controlling movement. Without enough of it, you get the tremors, the stiffness.
Correct. So the challenge is, how do you compensate for that lack of dopamine?
And somehow, ergot alkaloids can help, even though they can also mess up neurotransmitters. Seems odd.
Yeah, it does seem counterintuitive, yeah. The video used a good analogy. Imagine dopamine is like a specific key for a lock on a nerve cell receptor. In Parkinson's, you're losing those keys.
Okay.
Now, some ergot alkaloids are shaped kind of like the dopamine key. Not exactly the same, but similar enough.
So they can fit into the lock or, like, jiggle it a bit.
Sort of. They can bind to those dopamine receptors and trigger some kind of signal. They're not dopamine, but they can pick up the slack, as the analogy went. Like mistaking someone for a Stir employee, they might still try to help you.
Huh, okay, so they mimic dopamine's effect, at least partially, leading to better motor function, fewer tremor.
That was the outcome, yes.
Yeah.
For many patients, it offered significant relief.
Hmm.
But there was a major downside.
There always seems to be a but with powerful compounds. What was it?
A serious long-term side effect called fibrosis.
Fibrosis. That's like excessive scar tissue?
Essentially, yes. An overgrowth of connective tissue, building up around organs. And it was particularly problematic when it affected the heart valves.
Oh, wow. That sounds really dangerous, impairing heart function.
Very much so. And because of that risk, these ergot-based drugs are often not the first choice for Parkinson's anymore. In some places, they're actually restricted or banned for this use.
So a promising therapy ultimately limited by its side effects. A common story in drug development, I guess.
It is. But the research didn't just stop. Scientists kept looking at these ergot alkaloids, thinking, what else could they do?
And that led to diabetes.
Yeah.
And maybe Alzheimer's?
Yeah, the SciShow video mentioned ongoing work in those areas. Let's take diabetes first. There's a drug called cyclozet.
Cyclozet. That's ergot-derived.
It's a semi-synthetic ergot alkaloid, yes. Initially developed with Parkinson's in mind, actually.
But it ended up being approved for type 2 diabetes. How does that work? What's the connection?
It's pretty complex, but fascinating. It seems to work by targeting dopamine receptors again, but this time in the hypothalamus region of the brain.
The hypothalamus. That's like the body's control center for hormones and metabolism, right?
Exactly. By binding to receptors there, cyclozet seems to influence the release of hormones like cortisol and growth hormone. And this helps to kind of reset the body's internal clock, its circadian rhythms.
Resetting rhythms. How does that help with diabetes?
Well, disruptions in those rhythms are linked to problems with regulating blood sugar and fats. So by helping to reset them, cyclozet can improve the body's ability to manage glucose and lipids.
Interesting. So it's working through the brain's hormonal control systems to impact metabolism.
That seems to be the mechanism, yes.
Yeah.
And the video noted it works best alongside diet and exercise. It's not a replacement for lifestyle changes.
Right. More of a supportive therapy. Okay, so that's diabetes. What about the Alzheimer's research? That sounds very cutting edge.
It is. It's based on a study from just 2023, looking at cyclozet again.
Alzheimer's. We know that involves the buildup of amyloid beta plaques in the brain and a lot of inflammation.
Right. And that chronic inflammation is really damaging to brain cells. The thinking involves a specific protein called toll-like receptor 4, or TLR4.
TLR4, what does that do?
It's part of the innate immune system. Think of it as an alarm sensor. It detects threats, like bacteria or damaged cells, and triggers inflammation to deal with them.
Okay, an immune alarm.
But in Alzheimer's, it seems the amyloid beta plaques constantly trigger this TLR4 alarm, leading to too much inflammation. Chronic, damaging inflammation.
Ah, the alarm is stuck on.
Pretty much. So the hypothesis they're testing is whether cyclozets can bind to TLR4 and somehow dampen that excessive response. Calm the alarm down.
So potentially reducing the harmful inflammation in the brain?
That's the hope. If they can reduce the inflammation, maybe they can slow the disease progression. But, and this is really important, it's very early days for this research.
Understood. No guarantees it'll pan out as a treatment.
Absolutely not. But the potential is intriguing. The video mentioned if it did work, it might offer a single drug approach, which would be simpler than the drug cocktails many patients currently need.
Definitely a potential benefit.
And really, even beyond these specific examples, the sheer number of alkaloids in ergot. It makes you wonder, like the SciShow host said, what else might be waiting there to be discovered?
It does leave you with that sense of possibility, doesn't it? Science chipping away at these complex natural compounds.
While enjoying a nice, non-hallucinogenic sandwich, hopefully.
Yes, definitely fungus-free. And, speaking of getting the full picture, the SciShow video was supported by Ground News.
Ah, yes, ground news. Their whole thing is showing you how different news outlets are covering the same event, right?
Exactly. So you can see the range of perspectives, maybe spot potential biases, or see what different sides are focusing on. It helps you avoid those news blind spots.
They had that interesting example about the ancient DNA study linking it to higher rates of MS and Alzheimer's in Europe.
Right. And they showed how outlets with different political leanings covered it, which could give you a skewed view if you only read one type of source.
Yeah, and even just the headlines varied. Like one German paper saying MS is common in Europe, while NBC News specified Northern European ancestry. Small differences, but they shape understanding,
It really shows the value of seeing that comparison laid out, helps you be a more informed, critical news consumer.
which is ground news's goal, basically, empowering people to get a broader view.
So, wrapping up our own deep dive here, what's the big takeaway from this whole Ergot saga?
For me, it's the sheer complexity and, well, the duality. How this one fungus could be responsible for centuries of sickness and fear.
Yeah, the St. Anthony's fire, the hallucinations.
And yet, hidden within it were the keys to life-saving medicines for childbirth, for migraines, maybe even for Parkinson's, diabetes, Alzheimer's down the line. It's just a stunning example of nature holding both danger and remedy.
Often in the very same place. It's not always black and white, good or bad.
Not at all. And it really sparks that final thought, doesn't it?
You mean, what else is out there?
Exactly. This one fungus holds so many potent, complex chemicals. How many other potential breakthroughs are just sitting there in nature, in plants, in fungi, in microbes, just waiting for us to find them?
Makes you wonder what the next Ergot story might be. A really fascinating thought to leave things on.